In the wild, untamed wilderness of 17th century Manhattan, the most powerful force wasn't a military governor or a wealthy merchant, it was a black-robed dominie clutching a leather-bound Bible. While other empires came to the New World seeking gold or escape, the Dutch arrived with a systematic, ironclad worldview that viewed the rugged frontier as a theater for the sovereignty of God. This is the story of how a small group of persecuted refugees from the Low Countries didn't just build a colony, they planted a theological powerhouse that would shape American education, politics, and the very concept of religious freedom. The history of the Dutch Reformed Church in America is not merely a chronicle of an immigrant denomination, it is a narrative of theological resilience, cultural adaptation, and the transplantation of a rigorous European worldview into the untamed landscape of the New World. From its inception, this tradition was defined by a struggle for identity, initially against the religious hegemony of the Spanish Empire, and later against the secularizing and pluralistic pressures of the American frontier. The Church's journey reflects a persistent tension between the Old World standards of the classis of Amsterdam and the New World realities of commercial expansion and revolutionary fervor. By examining its evolution, we uncover how a small, persecuted body of believers forged a lasting legacy through a unique synthesis of systematic theology, presbyterial governance, and a liturgical focus on the sovereignty of the Word. The emergence of the Dutch Reformed Church was a phenomenon born of fire and intellectual ferment. During the 16th century, the Low Countries existed as a collection of 17 provinces under the dominion of the Habsburg Empire. While these lands were historically steeped in Roman Catholic tradition, they were simultaneously a crossroads of European commerce, making them uniquely susceptible to the winds of religious dissent blowing from Germany and Switzerland. Long before the specific tenets of Calvinism arrived, the cultural landscape was prepared by indigenous movements such as the Brethren of the Common Life. These groups fostered a devotio moderna, which prioritized internal transformation over the external performance of ritual. This emphasis on personal piety and biblical literacy created a populace that was increasingly skeptical of clerical mediation and more receptive to the idea of a direct, unadorned relationship with the divine. Complementing this spiritual hunger was the intellectual rigor of Northern humanism, embodied by Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus provided the essential philological tools for reform, championing a return to the original Greek and Hebrew scriptures. By stripping away centuries of medieval commentary, humanism allowed Dutch thinkers to scrutinize the foundations of their faith, creating an environment where the pure word could eventually supersede ecclesiastical tradition. The transition toward a distinctly reformed identity was not immediate, but occurred through a series of ideological waves. In the 1520s, a Lutheran current first challenged the status quo, punctuated by the execution of two Augustinian friars in Brussels in 1523. By the 1530s, a more radical Anabaptist movement swept through the working classes, appealing to the marginalized, with its call for strict moral discipline and a simplified church structure. However, it was Calvinism that ultimately triumphed as the defining framework for the Dutch revolt in the 1540s. The reason for this dominance lay in the marriage of systematic theology and organizational durability. The reign of Philip II of Spain brought the religious tensions to a breaking point. Through the implementation of draconian heresy laws and the brutal military administration of the Duke of Alva, this era of the Council of Troubles did not succeed in crushing the movement. Instead, it forged a refugee identity. Protestants fled to refugee centers in England and Germany, establishing what became known as the Churches under the Cross. In 1566, the simmering resentment against Spanish Catholic dominance erupted in the iconoclastic fury. This was not merely an act of vandalism, it was a theological declaration of independence. This religious upheaval catalyzed the 80 Years' War, a protracted conflict where the struggle for sovereignty became indistinguishable. The eventual Union of Utrecht in 1579 formalized the 7 united provinces as a Protestant stronghold. As the movement sought to define itself, Guido de Brès emerged as a pivotal figure. In 1561, de Brès, a student of John Calvin, drafted the Belgic Confession to demonstrate the faith was rooted in biblical orthodoxy. Though de Brès was martyred by hanging in 1567, his confession became a foundational pillar of the Church's global identity, ensuring that whether in a secret room in Antwerp or a new settlement in the Hudson Valley, the Dutch Reformed identity would remain tethered to a God-centered theology. The theological identity of the Dutch Reformed Church was not merely handed down as a finished product from the early reformers. It was hammered out through a period of intense internal friction that nearly fractured the young Dutch Republic. This era was defined by a transition from a general Protestant consensus to a highly specific scholastic orthodoxy that would govern Reformed thought for centuries. The catalyst for this doctrinal sharpening was the work of Jacobus Arminius, a professor at the University of Leiden. Arminius began to question the rigid interpretations of predestination that had become standard in the Dutch Church. He proposed that divine election was not an absolute decree made before the creation of the world, but was instead based on God's foreknowledge of an individual's future faith. In 1610, following Arminius' death, his supporters formalized these views in a document called the Remonstrance. This petition outlined 5 points that challenged the established order: the idea that God's choice is conditional upon human belief, the belief that Christ died for all people, not just a chosen elect, the assertion that while grace is necessary, it is not irresistible and can be rejected by the human will. This was more than an academic disagreement. It was a national crisis that threatened the political stability of the Netherlands during its ongoing war with Spain. The Remonstrants Arminians and the Contra-Remonstrants strict Calvinists became rival factions that split families, city councils, and the military. To resolve the impasse, the Dutch government, the States General, convened a national synod in the city of Dordrecht, also known as Dort, in 1618. Recognizing that the issues at hand affected the entire Reformed world, they invited distinguished theologians from Great Britain, Switzerland, and various German states. This converted a local dispute into one of the most significant ecumenical gatherings in the history of Protestantism. The presence of international delegates ensured that the resulting decisions carried an authority that transcended the borders of the Netherlands. It signaled to the rest of Europe that the Reformed churches were a unified front, capable of defining their boundaries against what they perceived as theological error. The Synod's response to the 5 points of the Remonstrance was systematic and uncompromising. They produced the Canons of Dort, which provided a point-by-point refutation of Arminianism. These 5 responses are famously summarized by the acronym TULIP, which established the definitive boundaries of Reformed orthodoxy. Humanity is so corrupted by sin that no one can choose God without divine intervention. This rejects the idea of human free will in salvation. God's choice of who will be saved is based solely on his sovereign will, not on any foreseen merit. This places the source of salvation entirely in the character of God. While Christ's death is sufficient for all, its saving efficacy is intended specifically for the elect. This ensures that Christ's work on the cross is a guaranteed success for his people. When the Holy Spirit calls an individual to salvation, that person cannot ultimately refuse. This emphasizes the power of God over the stubbornness of the human heart. Those whom God has chosen and called will never fall away from grace. Their salvation is secure. This provides the believer with a deep sense of spiritual security. These canons were immediately integrated into the Church's confessional standards, joining the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism to form the 3 forms of unity. This trinity of documents ensured that every minister in the Dutch tradition, including those who would later sail for America, shared a common, rigorous, and God-centered vocabulary. One of the most enduring legacies of the Synod was the authorization of a new official Dutch translation of the Bible from the original Greek and Hebrew, completed in 1637 and known as the States Translation, also known as Statenvertaling. It did for the Dutch language what the King James Version did for English. The Statenvertaling served as a unifying cultural force, standardizing Dutch grammar and vocabulary through its use in every pulpit and household. Because the translation included extensive marginal notes explaining the text through a reformed lens, it deeply embedded the theology of Dort into the daily speech and thought patterns of the Dutch people. The victory of the Calvinist party at Dort established the Reformed Church as the official, state-supported religious institution of the Netherlands. This provided the Church with immense institutional stability and control over the universities such as Leiden, where future ministers were trained. However, this period of dominance also ushered in an era of Reformed scholasticism. As the Church shifted from being a persecuted minority to a powerful establishment, the focus often moved from the passionate, experiential faith of the churches under the cross to the precise intellectual maintenance of complex doctrinal systems. While this ensured theological purity, it also created a formalist environment that would eventually spark pietist reactions both in the Netherlands and in the American colonies. The liturgical life of the Dutch Reformed Church was shaped by a fundamental desire to strip away what it viewed as the idolatrous accretions of the medieval period. In its place, they developed a functional style of worship that prioritized the ear over the eye and the communal action of the people over the solitary ritual of the priest. Because the Reformed faith was illegal in the Netherlands during much of its formative period, the most important liturgical developments took place in refugee centers like London and Emden. Johannes Alasko, a Polish reformer leading the Dutch Stranger Church in London, produced the Forma Acratio in 1550. This manual replaced the elaborate Roman Mass with a service centered on continuous biblical reading and communal prayer. The London model introduced practices that would become hallmarks of Dutch Reformed identity, such as the rejection of the kneeling posture at the altar in favor of sitting around a common table for the Lord's Supper. This shift was intended to emphasize the priesthood of all believers, signifying that the congregants were equal guests at Christ's banquet rather than passive observers of a priestly mystery. The Dutch followed the Swiss, Zwinglian, and Calvinist understanding of the sacraments. They rejected the physical presence of Christ in the bread and wine, viewing the elements instead as signs and seals of a spiritual reality. They believed Christ was truly present to the believer, but through the agency of the Holy Spirit rather than through a physical change in the elements. As a result, the liturgy was designed to be intensely didactic, educational. Every celebration of baptism or the Lord's Supper included lengthy, systematic explanations of the rite's meaning to ensure that the congregation was not engaged in empty ritual, but was participating with an informed and active faith. In 1566, Petrus Dathenus prepared the liturgical forms that would eventually be standardized by the Synod of Dort. In this tradition, the sermon was not a brief moral exhortation, but the undisputed center of the service. These sermons were often an hour or more in length and were designed to be thorough teaching moments. In many congregations, the minister was expected to preach through the entire Heidelberg Catechism over the course of a single year, ensuring the laity was well grounded in systematic theology. The visual environment reinforced this focus on the Word. Ministers abandoned ornate vestments for a simple black gown, cassock, and white bands. Church buildings were stripped of statues, crosses, and colorful windows, creating an acoustic space where nothing would distract the eye from hearing the gospel. The physical center of the church moved from the altar to an elevated pulpit. Often positioned so, the minister literally looked down upon the congregation with the authority of the word. Unlike the weekly mass of the medieval era, the Dutch Reform typically celebrated the Lord's Supper only 4 times a year. These were occasions of immense solemnity, preceded by weeks of intensive spiritual preparation and censura morum. an inquiry into the moral conduct of members. When the day arrived, members would leave their pews and gather around a large wooden table placed in the center of the sanctuary. This practice of sitting as a family emphasized the communal and egalitarian nature of the covenant community. This specific liturgical rhythm, the long didactic sermon, the quarterly common table, and the plain black gown ministry is what the Dutch would eventually transplant to the Hudson Valley and the wild frontiers of New Netherland.